A video game is a sum of its parts, whether that be artwork and design, its storytelling, characters and acting, or arguably the most important component, gameplay. But one often overlooked element of a game is its sound and music. When I reminisce about older games that I used to play, or even some recent ones, one of the first things that I'll start doing is maybe replaying the theme of the game in my mind. The multiplayer menu theme from Black Ops 1, for example, or the Left 4 Dead 2 menu music, are ingrained in my brain permanently as things I used to hear on a daily basis. Of course, the actual experiences I had make up most of my memories of those games, but the memories themselves feel stronger due to the association I have with the music and the connotations of nostalgia that said music invokes. I think the soundtrack can often blend into a game in such an integral way that most won't even notice the impact it can have. So I hope that with this video, I can explore the many different ways that music can bolster the experience of a video game to a level unobtainable without it. I just recently finished Doom Eternal, an amazing game in almost every aspect, and I couldn't think of a better game to begin with that uses its music to the degree that Doom does. When playing that game and the soundtrack kicks in at optimal times, it truly engrosses you unlike anything I've played in quite a while now, and the way the game comes together as a whole really makes you feel like the Doomslayer. I know that's a very stereotypical game analysis trope at this point, to say it makes you feel like the character. But the difference is, the music in Doom to me is almost a personification of the Slayer himself. It's fast, hardcore, violent, and it gets straight to the point, doing everything in its power to get you into the mind of Doom Guy, to feel the one-man army fury inside of him, while you make your way through wave after wave of a variety of demons. The chaotic heavy metal score combines deep riffs, chainsaws and lawnmowers of all things, to get the adrenaline pumping before throwing you deep into its gameplay. The music in Doom is intrinsically tied to its gameplay also. Not only does it couple well with its fast pace, but it dynamically flows with it too. This has been explored to great lengths in some other fantastic videos based on Doom 2016 in particular, by both official channels and other YouTubers. But the general gist is that the music of Doom uses the player's actions to dictate what sections of the soundtrack plays at what moments.
So when the player does something really amazing and we want to kind of reward them for something, that's when the music kicks up a notch. Now, technically how we achieve that isn't always just by having stems and kind of layering more stuff on top of each other. I actually don't like that method. So instead what I do is break the music into chunks, into segments, right? And I can create, say, 50 variations on a verse. And then what we do is throw them into a container, and those verse variations just randomize. Then when the player does something really cool and we want to kick up to the chorus, it dumps out that container, plays a little transition and brings in the chorus. Those choruses can randomize for as long as they need to, and then it dumps back down into the verse when we need to do that.
Combine that with things like the music slightly dropping out mid-glory kill, and so on. When you come out the other end of a fight, you feel almost like the game was scoring to your exact gameplay. As far as I'm aware, this same design philosophy applies to Doom Eternal, but with Eternal being even faster than 2016, the possibilities have been opened for quicker and more intense sound, like you will find on that game's OST, that really helps to keep the momentum of gameplay pushing forward. Dynamic music is often quite common in the video game space, as described here, as it will be used in many games mentioned in this video. The extent in which it is truly dynamic and or impactful to the overall experience depends on the game, but I think the way Doom handles this is very well done. In the same way that Doom's soundtrack meshes with its gameplay, it really does a lot for the small details of the game, as well as the settings and atmosphere. When Doom slows down between fights, and you begin to take in the surrounding locales, you realise just how the music goes hand in hand with the aesthetic and art design, for instance, in a variety of ways. Key locations like Sentinel Prime, with its ancient and broken city, combine with an ethereal ambience marking the Slayer's return to his home away from home. Necroville, harkening back to a truly classic Hell-based level, iconic to something only Doom could deliver, with arguably the most heavy of the heavy metal tracks in the game. Or finally, Urdak, with its very strange, unsettling and haunting composition. This last one is very interesting to me, as it has a stark contrast with anything else you'll find on the soundtrack, but establishes the feeling of something alien and new immediately that still doesn't feel out of place. Despite being in literally hell for some sections of the game, you feel more uncomfortable when arriving on Urdak for the first time, due in part to the almost emptiness of this track. In behind the scenes videos, the lead audio designer described Doom Eternal as trying to be like a heavy metal album experience, and I think this really comes through in the aforementioned details throughout this section of the video. However, the previous locations I've mentioned also prove that Doom isn't just a one-trick pony when it comes to its music. It isn't afraid to drop the guitars or the electronic sounds for something more unique and or fitting to establish an atmosphere and so on, but still manages to tie everything together coherently and still echo the feelings of Doom. I think this is part of the reason it's very rare that someone will mention the recent Doom games without mentioning their soundtracks, or vice versa, and for good reason too, due to how intertwined they are with all of these elements within the game. Modern Doom, along with certain other games, has defined the impact a game's soundtrack can have, not only on the experience of a game, but its outside perception and identity. It has proven that with great music, a game can be elevated to new heights, and has done a lot to bolster the identity modern Doom has garnered over time. Identity is very important in the modern gaming space. When a lot of games all share similar concepts, it's crucial to make your game stand out in the right ways, and music helps that a lot. A game I absolutely love in a completely different genre that does something like this with its identity is Crash to Insanity. I can guarantee anyone that's played this game remembers the incredible a cappella score that accompanies it. The charm and character this score adds to the game is almost invaluable, capturing the wacky and quirky personality that Crash and his cast of characters was known for, and then bolstered by this game in particular in a way that I think the series has built off of ever since. A lot of people love Crash to Insanity, despite it being quite buggy and unfinished. There are a variety of reasons one could say they really enjoyed this game, however, as I did, but I do think that the music plays a large part, consciously or subconsciously, as to why people remember this game among others in the Crash series, following Naughty Dog's original 3 games. This game, like Doom, knew exactly what it wanted to be, and it used music to express that. There are so many other games that use music to bolster their identity, and it's very interesting in the diverse ways that music is implemented in these games, and therefore the different ways it has an impact. Another Naughty Dog series, for example, Uncharted, has this epic booming orchestral theme that harkens back to something like Indiana Jones, and it lets you know right from the title screen that the game is going to be a ragtag adventure. Hotline Miami combines its unique 80s inspired visual design with this really cool synthwave electronic soundtrack that not only sticks in your head, but also combines greatly with its quick top-down shooter gameplay. Banjo-Kazooie has a crazy amount of different individual level and area themes, which brought a lot to said areas, some that even change with gameplay, sort of like I mentioned earlier in the Doom section with this adaptive music design. Take when going underwater how the theme gets muffled, or my favourite level in the original, Click Clock Wood, whose theme changed depending on what season the level was in. This all worked exceptionally well to establish the fun, upbeat tone that Banjo-Kazooie has. Sunset Overdrive is another game that uses this adaptability, in which it combined its gameplay and soundtrack through movement. The punk rock attitude that was weaved into all of this gave it a distinctive feel, reminiscent of something not seen since maybe Jet Set Radio before it. Lastly, I of course couldn't make this video without mentioning Halo, a game whose theme is so iconic, I think its tune comes rooted in every gamer's mind. Marty O'Donnell's score was one of the biggest parts of Halo, how it made the sci-fi spaces feel unique and intriguing, and the overall experience very visceral. So its noticeable absence in recent games in the franchise, since Halo Reach, has generated constant discussion of how important it was to Halo. Some games though, the music is the identity. Games like Patapon, Geometry Dash and Guitar Hero all use music in its rawest form, not necessarily to bolster anything else as such, but as the core mechanic of the game itself. It's impossible, for example, to separate Patapon from its music, because with no music, there is no game. A lot of the music in these rhythm games, primarily games like Guitar Hero, is licensed music, rather than original soundtrack work, but it's incredible what music that isn't crafted especially for the individual game can do to refine an experience. There's clearly a very big appeal of having a grandiose, finely crafted original soundtrack in games, but there's an undervalued element that can come with pre-existing music. An obvious example of games that use licensed music are sports games. FIFA and Tony Hawk are always in tandem with some form of music, for instance, usually using popular songs to embody the period of time from the game's release. Regularly, if a game has a tangible connection to real areas or events, it will have a method of using licensed songs from an era or place and so on to reinforce their worlds and atmospheres. Grand Theft Auto has forever used a combination of soundtrack and licensed sound to push the game worlds to the player, often using the in-game radio as its outlet. Take Vice City with its 80s theme and vast array of artists like Indeep and Toto. San Andreas captured the following decade of the 90s very well with its music, including one moment that sticks with me in the Lowrider Challenge minigame, which also, funny enough, incorporated rhythm game elements. GTA 4 combined its licensed music with the storytelling by putting in a Russian-focused radio station that wouldn't be out of place in Nico or Roman's cars, which means one of my most prominent memories from that game is that awful German-Russian song, which I don't think is in the game now, but that's a different topic for another time. You might think that Doom is the de facto game for heavy metal, but everyone forgets about Brutal Legend, which weaved in many famous rock and roll performers as well as their songs into its story and lore, including the late great Lemmy from Motorhead among others. Brutal Legend tends to feel like a pure love letter to heavy metal, in a way that would be less achievable if it wasn't for the direct use of its many established anthems. One use of licensed music I've always liked, however, is the use of it in a game's advertisement. It may be cheating to mention the way marketing uses music, but it shows how even before a game releases, music can have a substantial impression on how a game will feel to the player by trying to get them to connect with a song that should ideally match with the game's spirit. Of course, this isn't always the case, as sometimes you can get an emotional trailer with music like this, but the game ends up coming out something like this. But when done correctly, the trailer music can become synonymous with the game, like Gary Jules' Mad World in the original Gears of War advert. Licensed music may not necessarily be entirely separate from original soundtrack work though, as many companies get in established artists to make music especially for games, given that perhaps their particular style meshes well with a pre-existing franchise, and so on and so forth. Some of the most frequently used artists on high-profile game soundtracks are people like Trent Reznor and Hans Zimmer, both from very successful music backgrounds that have gone on to make some of the most iconic scores in video games. Rockstar Games, developer of the aforementioned GTA series, have used bands like Health to score the entirety of the Max Payne 3 soundtrack. But not always though is a whole soundtrack made by one of these groups or artists. Sometimes singular songs are commissioned by studios to cap off important in-game moments, something that is also done in general with music to great effect. My personal favourite gaming moment of all time is the travel into Mexico from Red Dead Redemption, in which Far Away from musician Jose Gonzalez plays. This moment is so powerful to me and would be nothing without this song.
Just to feel alive again, pushing forward through the night, aching just to blur aside. It's so far away. It's so far away.
So far, I've spoken of original soundtracks and licensed music in games. There is one large part of music in gaming I haven't spoken properly on yet. Ambience. Ambient music is a genre of music that emphasises tone and atmosphere, and is often a through line in every good game of recent memory, an undercurrent that runs at all times throughout these games. When the main score stops thundering away, usually you're still left with that hint of something that is meant to evoke a reaction and ground you in whatever you are playing. There has been a lot of talk of tone and atmosphere throughout this video, as it's one of the key things music establishes. But this is most often where that tone and atmosphere comes from, and is by far the least noticeable thing in regards to the music as a whole, but potentially one of the most important parts of it. Given how important ambient music can be overall, it's common for the ambient music to not even be included on a game's album and so on, also adding to the reason it often goes unnoticed. Red Dead Redemption as a series is a masterclass in ambient music. Woody Jackson, Bill Elm, and the other artists and performers who worked on the soundtrack for the original game explained how they created ambient strings that would play at random integers to give that western sting when things were settled, just to remind you where you were, and it worked to fantastic effect. I always loved how in Dead Rising, whilst roaming the mall, you could always hear the catchy mall music, which prominently juxtaposed with all of the horror going on around you, with hordes of the undead, distressed survivors, and psychopaths. Horror games in general are actually one of the most noteworthy users of ambient music, as very few horror games like to clutter their sound, instead saving those musical moments sparingly for the oh shit moments with sounders and motifs. Ambient music is then usually used to bolster the atmosphere of either dread or safety. The iconic save room themes from Resident Evil are a great example of how music is used in these games, as it has the ability to turn the mood on a dime, making you go from being on the edge of your seat to a sense of calm once you enter one of those rooms. Ambient music highlights one of music's greatest strengths, and that is its ability to create emotion. In actuality, all of the music spoken about in this video so far is supposed to create some form of emotion, and it can be that emotion and how we feel that can sometimes leave a greater impression on us after the fact, after the game is over and we're watching the credits roll. Take many scenes from a variety of games whose music wasn't immediately apparent in particular moments. Strip it and you won't have realised the influence that it could have had. The latest God of War game had fantastic music, but the scene where Kratos gets the Blades of Chaos after returning to his home was so extremely powerful in part due to it. I was trying to re-watch this scene a couple of weeks ago and stumbled across a clip where the music had been turned off, and the difference it made to my emotional connection approaching the scene was astonishing. While talking of powerful and emotional moments in games, it would be a disservice to not mention The Last of Us, a game with such integral music that they are getting back the composer of the game to do the music for the newly announced TV show, which shows how intrinsically tied it was to the atmosphere and undertones of the game. The Last of Us's music is very muted. It's not often loud and bombastic, but it doesn't need to be. It leans more on the ambient side, and gives off a somber tone, but there's hints of hope throughout, just like the game's narrative which it connects to, and it has a poignant impact on the game as a whole. There's a fantastic video analysis on The Last of Us's music that goes into a lot more detail on individual scenes and tracks than I will spare for this game in this video, and I suggest that you check that out. It cannot be overstated how fundamental The Last of Us's music attributes to its emotional resonance. There's a great method used in music throughout the game and medium to create emotion, and that is through the use of callbacks in musical motifs. Both The Last of Us and God of War do this, as God of War uses music from the old games to connect you with Kratos' past, and The Last of Us plays up Joel's past as a character in a variety of themes that will play at relevant points throughout the story. These two examples create emotion in two different ways, one being nostalgic feelings for a franchise in the past, and the other being empathetic and sympathetic in nature towards the character of Joel directly. In other words, creating emotion through the combined design of storytelling and music. Like I previously alluded to, it's often how we feel which will be remembered over time, rather than the details of our experiences, and that applies greatly to video games. Furthermore, among the other key parts of a game as a whole, the music in many games can be an essential tool used by developers to emit emotion and hence create noticeable memorability in their games. There is a seemingly unending amount of ways that music can be applied in this art form, so if I miss something, whoops. But that's what I love about the music in video games, is just how integral it is in so many unnoticed and unmentioned ways. I didn't even speak in this video about specifics like title screen and end credit themes, and I didn't go into a vast amount of detail on how audio engineers actually incorporate the music. I didn't manage to mention every single game I would have liked to somehow, such as the incredible work done in the Ezio trilogy of Assassin's Creed, or the work Sarah Schachner has been doing recently on a bunch of games. But at the beginning of this video, I said about how music often blends into the experience, and you won't realise the impact it can have. Now I've spoken about how music bolsters the gameplay, atmospheres and settings, character and identity, storytelling, emotion, and the different ways it is handled in all these games. You'll have noticed just how this one part of a game's makeup can reverberate throughout. And that to me is why music makes the game.